Well, hello, I'm Ron Matsen. This is the Q&A program, broadcast from the River Lodge here in Roa, New Zealand. I have a number of distinguished guests with me this afternoon. I have, of course, Chuck Missler. Welcome to the program again, Chuck.
It's nice to be with you, my friend.
All right, and we have Bob Cornuke in the studio.
That really makes it special.
So, that's right. So we have all our Bible Explorer Indiana Jones costumes on today, just in honor of you. We're also joined with David Sielaff. Hello, David. How are you?
Hi, Ron. Doing great.
Excellent, excellent. Well, we're going to be talking about in this program is going to center on Bob's book called The Temple, which really has created an uproar in so many different areas. We're going to talk about not only the substance of the book, but why is it so controversial. So Chuck, I'll start with you. Why are archaeological things important to us as Bible students, or even are they? Are they important?
Well, absolutely, because they underscore a reality that we're dealing with. They're not just traditions or legends. We're talking about real things. And when you encounter a tangible thing like archaeology, it's important that it is in agreement with what with the truth. And what's amazing, more often than not, traditions are incorrect. In my opinion, I just notice so often we adhere to a tradition because of history. And it's amazing that something as fundamental to our anybody that's been to Israel and visited Jerusalem have all been, shown what they call the Temple Mount. And so Bob has really punctured that with reality, and it's very crucial to really understand these things are real. They're not hypothetical or arbitrary. No, they need to be correct.
Right. And so, Bob, I remember a few years ago, you invited Chuck and myself over to Israel. You were in the midst of writing this book and making discovery. What was the thing that really sort of launched you on this journey to tackle something so controversial as the Temple Mount and the city of David?
Well, I'm really the benefactor of a man named Ernest Martin and a good friend of mine, David Sielaff, who I've come to just really appreciate him for his heart and his mind. I started reading Ernest Martin's book about the temple being in the city of David, and when I started talking to people about this, the first thing I heard was impossible, zero chance, you're crazy, you're a heretic, it's blaspheming to even talk about this. And when you start talking in that paradigm that it's impossible or there's a zero chance, you're never going to get to the place of truth because you've already put up your barriers. And apparently people have already put up their barriers before you even talk about this. So to knock down, we just have tradition is just this big calcified ball that surrounds a lot of truth, and it's hard to penetrate that even with the Bible banging on it. But we banged on it and hit it with a sledgehammer, and sure enough, when you crack it open, there is just a plethora of truth that the temple is indeed in the city of David, even though it upsets a lot of people, because there's a lot of endearment surrounding the Western Wailing Wall, the temple. It's beloved, it's revered, it's worshipped. But if it is wrong, then we've been worshiping the wrong place. And I always say you need to use the Bible as a roadmap and as a compass, and it's the final arbitrator and it's the final mediator on all this. It's not my opinion or your opinion or even Chuck's opinion or David's opinion.
Really?
I'm sorry, Chuck. Okay, I'll amend that. Chuck's opinion we put aside. But we need to use the Bible as the final, and that's what Chuck taught me, all kidding aside, when I was a young police officer, many years ago, when we were riding our covered wagons and our police cars. Chuck would teach me, follow the Bible, always sola scriptura. You use the Bible as the sole source, and that's what I did. And if you read the Bible, it literally shoots a flaming arrow into the city of David. And I was amazed to see that. So I think people at least need to be like Bereans and check it out instead of just putting up all these walls and say impossible.
Right. Well, we've had this discussion a few times, normally by Skype, but in this edition, of course, we've got David Sielaff, and we're happy to have you join us, David. I'd like to have you give our viewing audience a little bit of background about you and why you have an interest in this whole issue of the city of David and the location of the real Temple of Solomon and Herod. Give us a little bit of your background.
Well, I grew up Lutheran, and then when I graduated college, 15 years after that, I went to Fuller Seminary and was in contact with Dr. Ernest Martin before that time. And he wrote an excellent book on the Star of Bethlehem and Golgotha and how the Bible was compiled internally. There's a lot of internal evidence that the Bible was compiled by the various editors and authors, like Isaiah and John and Peter. And also this book, The Temples That Jerusalem Forgot, which is the first book. And Dr. Martin, and I took over Dr. Martin's organization in January of 2002 when he died. The book came out in the year 2000 originally, and I want to praise Bob for really getting the word out on this subject. It doesn't matter so much who was first, who was second, or whatever. The important thing is that the truth on the true location, which can solve a lot of problems of history, even such things as where Christ was during his final hours, makes a lot more sense if you have the right location of where the temple is and its relationship to Antonia and Pontius Pilate and all that. Dr. Martin was in at the beginning in 1969 at the dig at the southwest corner, south of the Wailing Wall, in Jerusalem, at the dig that was organized by Professor Benjamin Mazar, one of the founders of Hebrew University and a major archaeological figure at the time. And Dr. Martin supervised the students and also helped obtain funding for the dig for 5 years between 1969 and 1973. So this whole process, he got to know Professor Mazar really well. And Professor Mazar, who died before Dr. Martin, they became lifelong friends until Professor Mazar's death. Professor Mazar's son, Dr. Ori Mazar, told Dr. Martin that before his father died, Benjamin Mazar came to believe that the temple was not on the Haram Sharif. Now, there's some discussion whether he was lying or telling the truth. And I've spoken with Ori Mazar personally, and he said, well, he never really answered that question. But Dr. Martin took this information and ran with it, much in the same way that Bob Cornuke got excited. And over a period of about 5 years, this book came out, Dr. Martin's book, 500 pages and 700 footnotes, and it's the definitive book in detail of what Bob has come up with, and he's added his own information to this, which is also very useful. So I'm just thrilled to have Bob, be a part of this study on all this thing.
Well, let me work from that standpoint and address a question to you, Chuck, and that is the sense that here you have an individual, a scholar, who is doing some research in the 70s and 1980s and into the 90s on a possible better location for the temple, and he's putting together the information, and he comes up to a different conclusion. Surely, as an author, an individual, as a free thinker, you've come up with lots of new and revolutionary ideas. Why does so many in the Christian church resist, in the first instance, the idea of something new upsetting their tradition?
Well, I think that's just human nature. They've been taught that. They visit there, and people keep calling it the Temple Mount, and they've been taught that by people they held in regard. And when Bob first came to me and said, exploring these possibilities, I encouraged him because his approach is to start from the text, and what the text says. And so I encouraged Bob to run with this because this was vital. It's not, relevant and vital and well supported. So I remember that very vividly. I encouraged you to.
Thank you.
'Cause he was trembling a bit because he realized that this challenges pretty deep roots for a lot of people who historically have identified themselves with Jerusalem and the traditions. And for him to challenge those traditions is healthy and constructive and biblically sound. And so I am guilty of encouraging Bob on
Aiding and
down that
abetting,
path.
I think they call
absolutely.
that. Yes.
Absolutely.
Yes.
And I have applauded Bob because that's his style, is to start from the text and not back into a defense of something. Let's find out what's really true. And that's the approach he took, and he struck gold, in my opinion.
Right. Well, Bob, you're certainly no stranger to coming up with alternatives in terms of the site of Noah's Ark, the Ark of the Covenant, the anchors of Paul, and so on and so forth. Mount Sinai, probably the most well-known adventure that you've been on. And so you're not a stranger to stirring up trouble. But how would you characterize this effort with those in terms of the amount of research that you've put into this project on the temple in comparison to some of these other projects?
Well, like I said, Dr. Ernest Martin carried the heavy load. He carried the water on this one, so I'm a benefactor of his work. What I did was I went over on site and I tried to fill the holes and also add a lot of scriptural references because to me the silver bullet is the Bible, the words in the Bible. So I went over there, and it was about 10 trips so far that we've taken over there. And crawling around in the old sewers of Jerusalem, and I took you all down into, with Eli Shukran, the director of archaeology in the city of David. We went down into sanctuaries underneath that the tourists are not allowed to go to. It's off the beaten path, and there's some amazing temples right in the city of David by the Gihon Springs, close to where we think the temple is, that date back to Melchizedek. Supposedly. So we're finding things. This is unfolding at light speed, and I think that in the next 5-10 years, people are going to be really starting to lean towards a temple in the city of David conjecture.
Well, David, you've been involved in this project for a long time. As you said, you were a ministry partner with Ernst Martin and are also now responsible for carrying on that. And there seems to be an information blackout that almost took place from the time the book was published until it was noticed, almost 15 years it seems. But in that time period, there's been a lot of new discoveries that have happened since 2000, 2001 when Ernst Martin's book was first published, and then the publishing of Bob's book and other DVDs that have been made by other people on this subject. Can you give us just a short list of what some of those new discoveries are that further give witness to the idea of the city of David, or the temple being in the city of David, rather than up on the traditional Temple Mount?
Well, one of the most important things is what Bob focuses on, chisels right into the core of it. And I actually wish Dr. Martin would have promoted this even stronger, as well as myself. And that is that the city of David is Zion, and that's where the temple was. And most archaeologists, they simply deny this, or they try and stretch the city of David. But it just cannot work, just does not work. And Bob is focused on that like a laser. And that the other thing that he's come up with, and it's all supplemental, is the aspect of the stairway from Antonia. And we'll probably get into that later. But archaeological finds, nothing has contradicted our theory. And we've spoken at length, Bob and I both, to Eli Shukran. And we have answers for any objections, and other so-called people who have objections, scholars who have objections even, And I think we can deal with them quite well, much better than they can with our objections to their theory of the temple being on the Haram Sharif, the so-called Temple Mount. One author has actually said that there are 12 different sites, supposed sites, as to where on that platform the temple is actually located. So they don't know where the temple is. They all agree that it was somewhere on that platform, but there's a lack of evidence indicating exactly where. That's because it wasn't there in our understanding. So I'm not exactly sure. There's the coin under the that Eli Shakron located underneath the foundation stone in the southwest corner of the Haram. Well, I have an answer to that, but it's kind of involved, and it has to do with that particular portion was constructed after the temple was destroyed. So, because it was not part of the temple. But also another thing Bob focuses on, and Dr. Martin does too, is the aspect that Jesus said there would not be one stone upon another. When I went there in 1983 with Dr. Martin, those were my first questions to him, was what are all these stones doing here to build up this platform? And he said, well, that's just to the base. Well, once he's looked into it, that platform was part of the city that would have been included if Jesus' words were going to be true. But Antonia was not part of the city of Jerusalem. Therefore, that tower, that structure, that platform still exists today with original Herodian stones. Where we say the temple is located, Bob and I and Ernest Martin, many others, now as the numbers grow, where we say it is, there is not one stone upon another from the Herodian temple. There are early artifacts for the first temple, exactly as they should be. Jesus never said there wouldn't be stuff from the earlier temples. Everything fits, everything dovetails into the eyewitness account. And as Bob keys on also in his book, first comes scripture, then comes eyewitness accounts, then comes archaeology, then comes tradition. And that's the way it has to be, as far as I see.
Well, Bob, in reading Ernst Martin's book, David makes reference to the fact that he focused really on the Fortress Antonio being the Temple Mount, and all of his evidence was there, and then made references to the city of David. And the difference with your book, I think, to Ernest, yes, Ernst, it was that you really focused on using Scripture to prove the fact that the temple is in the city of David and Zion in the city of David. Yes, Chuck?
Well, I think you're setting aside the most important glaring evidence, and that is that there was an Antonio fortress that barracked, over 10,000 guys, and anyone that has another view has to explain where the glaring error is to ignore the need for the location of to recognize the Antonia Fortress requirement.
Yes.
And once you recognize that, everything else falls into place. And to mistake the Antonia Fortress, as the Temple Mount is an area of confusion, in a sense of speaking, that's inexcusable. The glaring requirement that has to be dealt with by anyone's theory, where is the Antonia Fortress? And clearly there's one place where it could be, and when we study the practice of Roman fortresses, they have a standard design that this fits exactly. And the whole history of that, I remember Tuvia Sagiv years ago used to point that out for other reasons, that we can really trace the whole history of that. But it recognizes the reality of the Antonia Fortress, setting aside for a moment, okay, where was the temple for the moment? clearly they can't co-locate. In fact, if you look at the scripture and the physical evidence, one is above and north of the other. So to me, the obvious path that Bob has nailed down and elaborated on and brought it into focus is the reality of the Temple Mount, of the Antonia Fortress. And once you deal with that, everything else falls into place. But what's so amusing to me is you watch people argue about this. They argue about everything except the glaring major issue.
The elephant in the room, so to speak.
Exactly, because you're talking about, we estimate about 10,000 barracks for 10,000 Roman soldiers. Where were they? No one has come up with an alternative hypothesis even. There wasn't room except right there. And then when you look at what the text, the encounters of Paul being protected by the Roman, you put that all together, it lays it out clearly. And Bob really picked that up and put it in focus. But the thing that fascinates me is the point of focus is the fortress, not the Temple Mount. That derives from our support for the Temple Mount argument. It comes from the reality that there is the elephant in the room, if you will.
Yeah, that's right. It's a strange thing, isn't it? It would almost be a historic inversion if after millennia, the only remaining remnant in Jerusalem that's identifiable to the first century was the Temple Mount and not the Roman fortress that housed 10,000 soldiers. Bob, comment on some of the reasons why this Fortress Antonio, what are some of those who favor the idea of the traditional Temple Mount being the location of Solomon's temple and Herod's temple, what are they supposing is the location of the Antonia Fortress then, this huge thing that would have had 10,000 soldiers?
They've never found one brick from the Antonia Fortress.
So it was absolutely...
They haven't found any, and it was there for over 300 years. It was designed to take control over the rebellious Jews. Josephus says it took the high ground, that it was the size of several cities, and that it loomed over the temple. You take those parameters, the temple being in the city of David, that fits. Nothing else fits. Another thing is water. The Romans needed to have water. Why didn't they go to the Gihon Springs? Because it was holy water. They couldn't take so much as a drop without causing a riot. So where did they bring their water? 2 aqueducts came in from South Bethlehem and filled in cisterns underneath the Haram al-Sharif or the Temple Mount right now, because that was Roman. The Romans couldn't have access to the water. The Jews wouldn't require, because the Jews had to wash in the water of the Gihon Springs. Has to be running water for purity, for the priests to go in for the sanctuary for their duties. They had to wash, and they also had to have and be anointed with olive oil, which we found that sanctuary, we can see where they ground the olive oil. So the water, to me, where the heart pumps the blood is in the city, is in the Gihon Springs.
In fact, the whole
not on the
issue,
Temple Mount.
The whole issue there, why did David conquer the Jebusites in the first place? That's a barren place. No, the water was to them as like oil is to us today. In other words, the basics for water was the initial motivation for David to attack it in the first place. And if you look at the whole history of that, everything pivots around the Gihon Spring as a source. And the fact that they couldn't, the Romans couldn't use that. They had to bring it. They constructed these aqueducts to get the water they needed because they couldn't. But the whole story, the whole history of the region pivots on the Gihon Springs.
Right. Well, let's take this conversation now, because I think this is oftentimes you can present your own case in a way to where someone just simply says, well, that's nice, but here's my case. But I think you've identified the elephant in the room here, and that is that if the Temple Mount, the traditional Temple Mount, was the place of Solomon's temple, then where is the Antonia Fortress? It's been completely wiped out, not one stone left. David, I'll turn to you, because really you've been dealing with this longer than anyone else. Could you give us some ideas of what are some of the problems with the Antonia Fortress being the Temple Mount or even what are some of the reasons why it has to be the Roman fortress versus the traditional Temple Mount? Give us some of the problems.
As Bob and Chuck mentioned, yeah, it's the water. There's been a recent major study, a compilation study, looking back at all the water surveys that have been done in Jerusalem regarding ancient sources of water. And Professor Shimon Gibson has concluded that all the aqueducts, the earliest aqueducts come from the Hasmonean period, after the time when the exiles came back from Babylon. And there were no aqueducts from Bethlehem and south until that period. So where did Solomon get the water? I can imagine, I have this image in my head of remember in Fantasia when you have the buckets and the brooms conducting the water, and there's no way to truck that water up a third of a mile, and the basin, the size of the basin, which was huge, and you're going to have the Levites doing this on the Sabbath and on the holy days? I don't think so. So how did they get because the Gihon Spring, even at the top of the hill, is lower than the area of Antonia. So it's just a fantasy, and no one has found where the spring is on Antonia, because there is none. There are only cisterns. And they still say, well, there's a Talmudic citation, but I can never get anyone to tell me what that citation is. We have 6 historical sources, and 3 of them are eyewitnesses that say that there was a fountain inside the temple. And what happened is the water was literally pumped up under pressure from the Gihon underneath up 40 stories to the top of the platform above and west of the Gihon Springs. We have a hydrologist who has confirmed the nature of the spring, the Gihon Spring. Nothing like this exists on the Haram Sharif. And this type of spring is the same system that they have at Megiddo, by the way. If you've ever been to Megiddo, it's the same thing. I think both of them are, I think the Megiddo system is broken now. You know, it's lost its siphon. It's lost its karst capability. But the Gihon still flows, but at a diminished capacity than it did in the past. I mean, eyewitness of Aristeas in 180 BC, he says that it was a massive flow of water and it pumped it up into the fountain. So somehow they diverted it from going to the Siloam's spring and were able to divert it to go up for a period of time during the day when the water flowed at its maximum. It's just a fascinating system, and we have hydrological studies explaining how this works, and it fits the system. The Roman historian Tacitus says there was an inexhaustible spring in the temple on top of the hill. Aqueduct water is not good enough for that purpose, for purification.
So, Bob, as a former detective, if I can use Chuck's identified the elephant in the room, would you call the lack of water the smoking gun in terms of the real proof that this cannot be the Temple Mount, just simply by the fact that there is no supply of fresh water there?
Absolutely. You have to have running spring water. It's an absolute 100% requirement for the priests to have for their washing, for their services in the temple. And like David just said, they're not going to walk it up during, holy days and take it up to the top of the hill and during Shabbat. And so they're not going to do that. But inside the temple, they had water gushing up. The only place you can find that is in the city of David. But tradition is such a strong thing. Jesus says in Mark 7:13, your traditions will nullify the Word of God. But we have a string of scholars today, and the most resistance I get on this are guys that wrote big, heavy books, have a big, heavy investment on this, and they say the word impossible before they see the evidence. But if you're really open to the evidence, it clearly says the temple has to be on the city of David. Now that opens up a whole new situation of the Jews can now rebuild their temple. Now we go into something that really becomes very provocative as to future events occur.
Well, let's go to that, Chuck, because that's kind of the next step in all of this is, from your perspective, especially being a prophecy Bible buff, what sort of opportunities does this now open up for the Jews in terms of is the building of a temple a necessity?
There's another piece of the puzzle that might be spoken of.
Okay.
And that is the recognition that a threshing floor was not necessarily at the top of a hill. It was at a saddle point.
Yes.
You with me? Mm-hmm. And as you look at the topology, the temple, what we call the Temple Mount, is even higher altitude. But the where the threshing floor was really a saddle point, about 741 meters above sea level. But that's not the peak of the hill. The peak of the hill is at 777. In other words, another 30 or so higher. And that's where there's a lot of confusion, because everybody presumes that the threshing floor phenomenon was at the top of Mount Moriah. No, it's at the saddle point where there was a breeze through there. And so that's another source of confusion, is to recognize, first of all, that the area they used as a threshing floor wasn't at the peak of that whole ridge. And at the top of the whole ridge was where the Romans built their fortress. But it's got nothing to do with the threshing floor phenomenon. You got to disconnect those to really understand the domain there. And from the beginning, Bob recognized that right away, that we separate those issues. The fact there's been traditional confusion about what Zion really means, because the site of Zion as such was lost, because it was obliterated, so to speak, had to be rediscovered, if you will. But Zion and the peak of Mount Moriah are not the same thing. The Zion, the real Temple Mount is lower than the Antonia Fortress. Once you recognize that, everything falls into place. But it requires someone to let go of these traditions that have been, everybody that's visited New Jerusalem that has been subject to the guides, Christian and Jewish, whichever, have been mistaught about what the term they use, they call it the Temple Mount. No, that wasn't the Temple Mount, that was the Antonia Fortress. Because if you set that aside, just start with the issue, where was the Antonia Fortress? That becomes a major issue to deal with, because that's a gigantic requirement that endured. So there should be evidence for it. Well, there is. It's staring in the face. In fact, it's in the way of recognizing the truth. And that is, as we begin to rediscover where Mount Zion really was, which was to the south still, then all of the rest of it fits together. And that's one thing Bob does in his book on the temple, is to really highlight, to disconnect those issues, the temple versus what we call the Temple Mount.
Right, Bob. The idea of the threshing floor, of course, and the city of David and Zion. What's interesting to me is that when you go to Israel today, or you look at any pictorial rendition of the first century Jerusalem, what is now the archaeological site of the city of David is just shown as a plowed field. It's never shown as a part of Jerusalem during the time of Christ.
There's not one stone left upon another, right?
And Micah, the minor prophet, predicted it to be plowed like a field. 1930, we have photos that it's plowed like a field. But, Scripture gives us a real pin in the map, and it says, as Chuck was just saying, when David took the stronghold of Zion, the angel of the Lord appeared to David. After that, and told him to buy the threshing floor, and Scripture says that's where the temple was built, on the threshing floor. Detractors will say, well, you can't have a threshing floor within a walled city, so it has to have been outside the city. No, that's not true. This is a city designed to be totally functioning because of a siege. They were the ultimate preppers. They had a high stone wall, and when David tried to take it, the people on the wall said, they laughed at him. It's even the blind and lame could repel this, because they had the water and they were self-sufficient in time. Yes, we have many instances in history where threshing floors were inside the city walls, and not always on the top of the mountain. You know, it would be the most advantageous place for wind to separate the wheat from the chaff. So all these detractors are coming up with these very weak defenses, and Scripture is just screaming out that the temple should be in the city of David. I don't know, David, what you think about all the threshing floor controversy. Do you have anything to add on that?
David?
That's me.
Yeah. Just David, what's your thought on the threshing floor?
Well, the threshing floor on the Haram doesn't exist. The Haram the whole platform is filled in around a large 50 cubit rock, 50 cubits tall, which is 75 feet. 75 feet tall, and the Dome of the Rock is built over that rock. There is no original flat surface there. It's really quite remarkable. They're saying it's always been a flat surface, and it never was. I mean, Josephus accurately describes Antonia as that platform that everyone today considers to be the Temple Mount. There was no threshing floor there.
So David, how big is this for our viewing audience who wouldn't necessarily be that familiar with this area, other than maybe a photograph or two of the Western Wall and the Dome of the Rock and so on and so forth? How big is this area that we're talking about when we consider it to be the fortress of the Romans?
35 acres.
Well, it's a trapezoid. It's not a square, because they worked around properly with the lay of the land, and it's over 1,000 feet on two sides and little over 900 on the other two sides, and all four sides vary. So acreage, I don't have it at the tip of my tongue right now.
Chuck, you've got.
The typical, the pattern you see repeated all through the Middle East of Roman fortresses are approximately 35 acres.
Right.
Mm-hmm.
But when you go through the math, you also need to understand you're talking about a legion and its support personnel. You're talking 10,000 people that need to be barracked and done in a systematic way. And what's fascinating, when you go to up north, what's the other place where there's still existing?
Or in Lebanon, you mean?
Yeah.
In Baalbek.
Baalbek, that's
yeah.
what I was fumbling for. You look at Baalbek, you see that same model. Tuvia Sagiv, an architect in Jerusalem, has made a study of just the Roman architecture. And they had a standard pattern they used, typically approximately 35 acres, and they typically had a religious place, then a courtyard, and the other side a polygon. And that pattern is replicated in each place. And in where we call the Temple Mount, that's exactly what is there. There it happens to be an octagon rather than a hexagon, but the point is the Roman patterning of fortresses is consistent all through when you make a study of those. It's just one of a series, and it's no different than all the others. But the problem you've got, if you reject that, what are the alternatives? There isn't any place around Jerusalem that you can drop, a 35-acre or roughly edifice. It's there.
Yes.
Can I ask David a question? David, the number one problem I'm running up with scholars, and you've answered this for me, and so, but for the audience's benefit, the big question is, they say there's no way that the temple could fit in the city of David. I'd like you to answer that for me.
Well, they're misapplying the measure from Mishnah Midot 2.1. And it says that the temple was 500 cubits by 500 cubits. Now, a cubit is depending on 22 inches or 18 inches, which would be 750 feet on a side square. Josephus says that the Herodian temple, the other temples were different size, the Herodian temple was 600 by 600 feet square, a stade on each side, a Roman measure. Now, let's see, Josephus quotes, where is it here? Quotes a fellow by the name of Hecatus, who wrote about the time of Alexander the Great, and his writings are lost except in Josephus. And he says that the original Solomonic temple was 500 feet long and 150 feet wide. It was later increased in size by Simon the Hasmonean and later again enlarged by King Herod to the 600-foot square. So this 500 by 500 foot boundary was actually one of the three camps. The first was a camp of the priests, then the camp of the Levites, which was 500 by 500, and then the camp of Israel, which was 2,000 cubits. And this is, when this is properly understood, that is what the Mishnah 2.1 is talking about. And it's a little bit involved, but Jacob Neusner makes it clear in his translation of the Mishnah Midot 2.1 that we're not talking about walls at all. This is a traditional boundary beyond which or within which the Levites operate. The priestly area is within which only priests can operate or do operate. And the court of Israel, Gentiles can come in there, but they can only visit. They can't dwell there. And then, of course, we have that other barrier that they found the sign saying no Gentile is allowed past this particular point. The 500 cubit by 500 cubit would be larger than the Herodian actual temple as described by Josephus. The Mishnah Midot was not written by eyewitnesses. It was 250 to 300 years or perhaps even later. However, it is generally good history. Josephus was an eyewitness. He lived there when he was a child, when he was growing up. He was also an eyewitness when it was destroyed. And he had access to King Herod's court records. And he also had records to all the Roman records. They opened up the records in Rome to him, including the interviews of Eleazar, the interviews with the survivors at Masada, the women who told about the Antonia fortress still existing. Okay? So Josephus was there. His measurements must take precedent, but the Mishnah Midot can be easily explained. There's no problem there. Does that answer your question, Bob?
Well, that in that it goes, a lot of people don't read that Josephus says that the temple extended into the Kidron Valley, from valley to valley. And so now we have to realize that, people didn't build there because it was convenient or because it was a great place to build. They built there because this is where God said to build the temple, over the threshing floor. So they had to build there in this cumbersome place because it had the water, but the walls went out over into the Kidron Valley. And they were extremely deep, weren't they, David? They were extremely deep going into the valley?
Yeah, the valleys were probably 20, 25, 30 feet deeper than they are today. You've had 2,000 years of fill in the Kidron Valley to the east, and the Tyropian Valley was filled in. There's another story involved with that I'm not going to get into, when they threw a lot of stuff into that valley, and it's been considerably filled up. Both of them were a lot deeper in ancient times in biblical times, in the time of Christ, than they are today. Absolutely. And yeah, from valley to valley. Now that was something that somebody came up with that Dr. Martin didn't realize, a fellow by the name of Michael Sanders. And once he pointed out, you go, well, of course. Just like the stuff that Bob came up with City of David is Zion. City of David is where the temple was. In the saddle, like Chuck said, right in the saddle of the hill, on a crescent moon-shaped basic hill structure.
Now, Bob, when we were in Israel in June of last year, or in last year, we took a tour there. You and I took a tour there, and Israel was just announcing a new discovery that they found some ramparts on the western side of the city of David that were being attributed to Antiochus Epiphanes in that era of occupation by the Greeks at that point. And so if we take that as the western boundary that would have existed at the time of a temple, is there room enough from that boundary marker, we saw where that is, for there to be a platform stretching now out to the east into the Kidron Valley for this temple to be located there?
Absolutely. If you take the measurements of Josephus, and you take the fact that they built out into the Kidron, from valley to valley, it's perfect size. If you really want to measure it, and then I've done some more research. It talks about a bridge that was repaired. Josephus talks about a bridge being repaired that went from the eastern cloister. I think it's during the time of Agrippa II. The men were around. They needed work. They were grumbling because they didn't have work, and so they built this bridge, and it's a stade, which is 600 feet, which goes exactly over to the Silwan village. And then we take the writings of Josephus, and he says the ancient walls go around to the south by the pool of Siloam, by the pool of Solomon, and then it comes up along the western wall. Then it hits the eastern cloister of the temple at the Ophel. The Ophel is right where the Gihon Springs is located. Then it says the temple went on to the Fortress Antonia. So if you really get the right, and I'm an ex-cop, when you get the right guy, everything fits, and you know it very quick. And the wrong guy, sometimes you try to force things in there and you just don't get it, and you try to build a case because you want to. But you have to let the evidence draw you in the right direction. The evidence doesn't fit up on the Temple Mount. That's a square peg in the round hole thing. But if you go to the City of David, it's all milled to fine precision, and the words of the Bible fit perfectly there. The words of history dovetail there. And so people have big problems with the Temple Mount because it just doesn't fit. But they'll continue to fight that fight. But if you really follow what the Bible says in history, the Temple Mount is not the place, and the City of David is the place of the temple.
Mm-hmm. Well, Chuck, you had made mention of the fact of really pointing out the elephant in the room, the sense of the Antonia Fortress. Bob has talked about the fact that the only source of fresh water is in the Gihon Springs. But you made a reference which we didn't follow very much, but I'd like to talk about a little bit, and that is the idea of the southern steps, this large area coming out of the traditional Temple Mount of these carved southern steps, and the significance of that from a biblical standpoint, because there's a biblical narrative in Acts.
Yeah.
And
right.
tell us about that.
Well, Paul is being threatened. So he's, in effect, becoming the focus of an upheaval, a riot. And the Roman soldiers rescue him. But if you read Luke's writings, they left the area, which would have been the Antonia Fortress, and they went down to rescue Paul from the uproar that was occurring in or about near the temple area. In other words, clearly the temple area was a region that was lower in elevation than the Antonia Fortress. And you see all that laid out in the scripture because the Roman soldiers had to go down to rescue him, which doesn't make sense until you think it through, because They didn't go up to, they went from where they were, the barracks, the soldiers went down to rescue Paul and save him from the upheaval that was going on. And those references are several places, but that was the primary one. It's laid out right there in the book of Acts.
Yes, and also as they're bringing him back to the Antonia fortress, it says, and he stopped on the stairs and spoke to the people who were gathered below him. And of course, he speaks to them in Hebrews and
Sure.
Hebrew and gets them excited and whatever, and they take him back in the fortress. So yet again, if you make the traditional Temple Mount be not the Antonia fortress, then where are these stairs going down to the Temple Mount, to the north of the traditional site? There's nothing there. There's the pool of Bethesda and all that things that are on the other side where the northern part of the city is. So Bob, as you've now had this book out for coming on to 2 years, about a year and a half, and people have begun to react, some very favorably, some have really dug their heels in. Do you see a wind change yet, or is it still a battlefield? Kind of what's the casualty rate that's happening as a result of this book being out? Are people beginning to get the picture yet?
Well, I did going back to Chuck about 20-some years ago, he was saying to me, Bob, on Mount Sinai, he's saying, it takes about a generation to shift, okay? And so I did a survey around the Temple Mount, and everybody I interviewed that was, let's say, 40 and over, and this is, this is where the Jewish faithful are praying at the Western Wailing Wall. I went around and did a lot of interviews, and to a man above 40, 45 years old, it's get out of here. There's nothing you're going to say that's going to change me. I've been coming here with my father. His father came with his father and his father. So they are ensconced, and their paradigm is not going to shift at all, no matter how many books, no how much I lecture, whatever. But a fascinating thing happened. As I interviewed those that are 30 years and earlier, the vast majority of them say, cool. The temple's in the city of David. We can rebuild our temple. They're the internet generation. They're the information generation. And they're saying, this is awesome. So for those, we have a great, and then I'm told that the tour guides over in Jerusalem are going, this is the hot topic, the temple location in the book. This is what they're talking behind closed doors, away from the tourist, is, the temple. And so I've received everything from, I'm a heretic, I'm a blasphemer, I'm crazy, to this could be heralding in the new temple that we know as the tribulation temple, where the Antichrist goes in and declares himself God. So this is fascinating times that we're living in right now.
Right. Well, Chuck, when you and I went with Bob 2 years ago, we met with Eli Shukron and a number. And at that point,
that's
I remember
I identified it as a Melchizedekian. Yeah, right.
Yep. And even our guide at that point was very emotional about wanting to hold on to the Temple Mount rather than embrace the idea of the city of David. And it's been interesting just in the last 2 years to see even some of our key contacts there, how they're beginning to quote unquote, off the record, drift now into the camp of accepting that the temple is in the city of David. The city of David is south of the Antonia fortress, and the overwhelming evidence of the experts there is that it is not the traditional site. There was one event, though, that happened. It was October of last year that we went, and it was one incident that just is seared in my mind and memory, and that is that we were there early one morning, and Israel was getting ready to announce a brand new discovery. This was the discovery of these walls that were during the Grecian period.
Accra.
Yes. And they were going to announce it that day. Well, we were the first group to go in. Our tour guide, it happened to be the director of the dig happened to be her niece. And as we went in and they're showing us this live dig, do you remember what happened? As we went in, the curator, or whatever you call her, the person responsible for the dig, saw you in the crowd and said, "Oh my goodness, are you Bob Cornuke?" "Yes. Can I get a copy of the book, The Temple?" Now here is an expert who is just getting ready to make a huge announcement, and yet in her mind, the exciting part of the day was asking you for a copy of your book, The Temple. How did that make you feel 2 years on, in terms of starting to see that wind change?
Well, it makes
take
this
place?
thing, well, I can just answer that
Yeah.
with my form, if I may. It so overshadows what they were getting excited about, that made it a footnote.
Yes,
They were more concerned with the central issue that he had nailed in the book.
exactly.
And for her to acknowledge that before everybody was kind of amusing, because what it demonstrated to me was the reality. This is the issue,
Yes.
not the other things that they were excited about announcing.
Incredible, isn't it?
Well, I remember being in the hotel, Gloria over there.
Yeah.
Great hotel right inside the old city walls there at the Jaffa Gate. And I remember I remember had a representative from Benjamin Netanyahu who wants a copy of the book, and I'm signing it and my hand was shaking, signing it to Benjamin Netanyahu. You know, I forget what I said, but it was horrible handwriting, I'm sure. But then I kind of realized, and we had the head of Avi Digter, who's a former head, I think, of the secret police and whatnot, and he wanted a copy, and our team even met with him, because this has huge implications. If we're right, now let's say we're crazy and it's a theory, and David and I and Chuck and you and I, this is crazy, all right? All right, but if it's true, the implications are absolutely earth-shaking, because the Temple Mount is the most bloody place on planet Earth. War after war has been there, and the Bible predicts other wars occurring there. So if this is an old Roman fort and not the place of temple, this is huge, and it has geopolitical ramifications which are mind-boggling.
Right. Yes, Chuck.
I was going to say, if they get their hands on the book, from page 139 on, there are a series of sketches and diagrams that just raise the fog on the whole thing. Once you realize the topology, that Zion is at an altitude less than the other, that you suddenly, the whole thing becomes clear. And these diagrams that are in the book are one glimpse tells the whole story. It really simplifies, cuts through it, if you will, in my mind.
Yes, absolutely.
Done a great job here.
Well, David, you've been on this project certainly a lot longer than all of us together have been, and so you've seen it go from early research to the publishing of a book, which really the acceptance of it was, the silence was deafening. And yet, in the last few years, you've seen a real uptick. There's been some people that have really come along. It seems like this is the right time for this. Just give us a comment on what that must feel like as a researcher to finally see some fruit really coming forth from the effort that you and Ernst Martin were involved in for so many years.
Well, I've had the same experience with the tour guides, that they're coming around. They all know about it, and they don't like it. The Orthodox Jews do not like it. They hate it. They are actually enraged about it. They say we're anti-Semitic. Evangelicals, Christians, they think that it might be anti-Semitic, and it couldn't be anything further from the truth. We're trying to show them the truth of where the temple was located. So what they do with it is their business. God will open their minds eventually. Zechariah, 12, 13, and 14 tell us that. And I think this is part of that. So I think this is, I'm being very patient with God. It's the least I can do.
Yes.
But you all know what I'm saying. Yeah. I'm just, thrilled the way things are going on this. And Bob's got more information coming along, and I've done my own studies that have advanced this topic based on the correct location of the temple. So yeah, things are terrific. I'm happy as can be.
Excellent. Chuck, final comments?
No, I'm just going to say that, again, I don't know if you can get this, can they get this on the,
Yeah, we'll post that up. Yeah.
yeah, if you can, that diagram to me, once you realize that the Antonia Fortress was larger and higher in altitude, and then connected by the 600-meter bridges to the area of Zion as a whole elevation lower, it all becomes clear
Yes.
somehow. And that's one thing that this does so well.
Yeah.
It just zeroes right in on the elephant in the room.
Yeah,
Rather-
exactly.
Some of these other issues can easily get a casual observer confused, and I can understand that. But what is interesting is the intensity of commitment of people to the past rather than being open to the discovery staring them in the face.
Wow.
And that's one of the things that the real demand on each of us, I think, is to learn from that, is to be distrustful of tradition and open to evidence. And that's what's really led to this book, and I think is a lesson in much broader terms.
Yeah, absolutely. Bob, closing comment?
Do I have 30 seconds?
Yes, of course.
Okay, I just want to read a verse talking about the threshing floor. His winnowing fan is in his hand, and he will thoroughly clean out his threshing floor and gather his wheat into the barn. He will burn up the chaff with unquenchable fire. Of course, the believers are the wheat, and the barn is heaven, a good place to go, unquenchable fire, and those that are unbelievers is the chaff. Bad thing, okay? So this is another illustration. This verse is talking about the threshing floor, his threshing floor, which I believe is in the city of David where the future temples will be. And this verse is talking about a threshing floor, God's threshing floor. That's why David bought the threshing floor, and it had to be over the temple.
Yeah, absolutely excellent. So ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much for joining us. Gentlemen, well done. And for those of you who are interested,
Just remember, where two people agree, one is redundant.
That's right. We're. It's a great comment. You want to get Bob's book called The Temple and research it for yourself. As we always say here at Koinonia House, don't believe anything we have to say, but search the scriptures daily to see what we say are true, and check it out for yourself. So, gentlemen, thank you for joining us. And for you taking the time to be with us, God bless you as you continue to study His Word.
Indeed.